Okay. All right. So anyway, how you can apply game elements to a web system, something that's not necessarily a game, using game elements to make something more fun, make something more motivating. That's what gamification is all about, and the gamified web. So most of my resources for this presentation come from a course on Coursera with Kevin Warbach, and he's with the University of Pennsylvania. So I just thought I'd cite that there. The ultimate goal when creating a gamified system is to make it so that you complete your goal, but it's got some more fun elements in here. So this is an example of people brainstorming something, and they're bringing little Lego characters into it to make it more fun experience. So typical motivation for a lot of people, you start out, you're climbing a little bit, and then there's valleys, peaks and valleys, and then over time, you just become more, demotivated. But in games, it increases in difficulty to the point where you become more motivated. It's almost like when you start watching a show and the first episode maybe doesn't grab you, but the second episode, it gets more intense, it gets more complicated. So the onboarding process is when things are kind of sort of easy. You're introducing characters, you're introducing the concepts of the system or the game, and then you're climbing up in difficulty, and maybe there's a boss fight where you fight this big character, not just like the little minions, but the actual big boss. And anyway, and then you climb up more and more from there. Okay, and so for gamified systems, that can make a huge difference as far as motivation. So this is a game called Fold It, and researchers were trying to solve this puzzle of this HIV enzyme, and they were working on it for upwards of a decade. But then they created this game called Fold It, where people could come in and manipulate the proteins, and they solved the puzzle within 3 weeks using this game. So games can be pretty powerful. So on the spectrum of motivation, you want to be towards intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic motivation basically means that you don't necessarily want to do something, but there's all these other forces pulling you to do it. And then intrinsic motivation means you really have the drive to do something. So external regulation means just that you have to. Somebody's pointing the finger at you. It's your job, maybe. And then introjection means people are watching you. Maybe it's a status thing. You want to look good. Identification means you understand the idea that it's good. It's something that you want, maybe. And then integration just means that maybe you do have the desire to do it, but you still need a little bit of a push in the right direction, which is pretty much most things. Intrinsic motivation over extrinsic. This is a quote from Gabe Zickerman in one of his books, Gamification by Design. Intrinsic motivators create greatness, while extrinsic motivators are nothing more than pellets dropped for rats in a cage. So when we see extrinsic motivators, big flashy things, sometimes we kind of know that we're being manipulated. And intrinsic motivators are much more powerful, and especially in the long run. If you implement a lot of extrinsic motivators, you might see a steep peak and then a large drop off over time. And sometimes rewards can be demotivating. So a reward would be an extrinsic motivator. For example, this is another quote from the book. If a child plays piano for the inherent joy of doing so, then begins to win competitions, then subsequently loses, she will stop playing the piano. That is extrinsic rewards crush intrinsic motivation, which never returns. And sometimes this can happen, and I'll have more examples of this too. Punishment can be worse, when you think of rewards. Well, what about punishment? How motivating is punishment? Sometimes it backfires, of course. Rebelling, losing sight of goals, paying the price. Maybe I can take this punishment, if I could just make my job a little bit easier, something like that. And learned helplessness too. Of course, if you apply too many punishments, then people are gonna be like, well, what can I do? Okay, so building intrinsic motivation, your goal. The concept of a self-determination theory for building intrinsic motivation can be broken down into 3 steps. So building competency, autonomy, and then relatedness. So competency would be completing challenges, receiving affirmations tied to the behavior. One great site that does this is Free Code Camp. They have a little pop-up that comes up every time you complete a challenge. It's always challenge-driven, and they give you little affirmations, most triumphant, that just make you give a little feel-good something, that you've completed this challenge. Building competency over time, so you have a new skill, you put in the effort, and hopefully you come to unconscious competence over time. That's the goal. Keeping experts hooked beyond that would be continued creativity, giving them problems to solve, mentorship, and then something called the sunk cost fallacy, which is sort of a devious way to go about it. But you can remind them that they've spent this much time on the website, and wouldn't it be great, if that time wasn't wasted, basically. Autonomy, decisions aren't predetermined. So I put the game Legend of Zelda up here because in the Ocarina of Time, one of the old games, everything was predetermined. So you had to have this certain item to go to this certain temple, and you couldn't switch around. You couldn't choose where you wanted to go next. Everything was predetermined. You had no choices, basically. But in newer games, it's kind of an open world. People can explore and go where they want as they please. And in your system, you can set it up so people can explore different interests. Relatedness, so this is basically relating to other people, friends, sharing, that kind of thing. And then a bigger picture with the relatedness is being a part of something bigger. So societal good, like the game Folded. People were very motivated to complete that game because of what it would solve. Okay, and then something I think is sort of counterintuitive, cooperation wins over competition. You really want people to cooperate, and if you get them to be too competitive, like a little competition is good, but if you get them to be too competitive, this can be territory where you're running into ethical problems. For example, like in Disneyland, the laundry workers, they had this system, this gamified system where if they did as much laundry as they could in a quick amount of time, they would get rewarded for those things. And it came to a point where they were getting high turnover because people were getting so competitive that they would stop taking breaks, and they would get into arguments with each other, and morale was completely plummeted. So that was kind of a big failure for gamification there. So anyway, you got to try what you can do to get people to cooperate. A good example of this was the game Overwatch, and it replays the best of what everybody has done, and it's specific to what their job is in the game. So it displays their best stats and only the best stats, and it's quite a bit different than a lot of games, and whereas some games, it's more competitive, so they display the same stats, and it's about ranking like who's the best. But in here, it's like who's the best, you know, what did you do the best for your specific job, I guess. Okay, and so the elements here. So the dynamics of your system are basically what are the rules of your system and how you display progression, what's the reinforcement, and what's your narrative or like your user experience. Specifically, what are the challenges, how do you give feedback, and how do you get people to cooperate with each other? And then here's the components, so just the real stuff that people see. Gifting levels, quests, collections, unlocked content. That's a big one for the experts when people move through the system and get better acquainted with it. Don't forget the fun. That's basically the whole point of creating a gamified system, is to encourage motivation a little bit. There are a lot of examples of ways where you have this gamified element and it's not really necessarily fun, but it's like a little bit of a motivator. But overall, hopefully your goal is to make it a little more fun, not just motivating. So surprises, just little pop-ups and things like that. Hopefully not annoying pop-ups, but giveaways, that kind of thing. And then identity with avatars. This is a way that people can get creative in your system. They have a little more identity in it. Again, creativity. Anywhere that you can have people kind of put their stamp on something is a good idea. Easy onboarding. Here's an example of a game, Plants vs. Zombies. Like it starts out really easy. So there's not that many different kinds of plants. You kind of get the idea, and you can get going. The Slack bot is another example of onboarding, like how it can help you. Challenges. That's something else that you can incorporate in your system. Quizzes, sharing. One thing I will say on here is you don't want to have too many share buttons because if you have too many, then they won't click on anything. So leveling, progression, just a display bar. LinkedIn does this. Another thing I will say too about that is it's not that motivating unless they're like 80 to 90% complete. So that's something to keep in mind with progression bars. Little bit of nostalgia here. That's another fun element that you can incorporate. And this is what a system might look like with all the elements incorporated. And then here's just some resources. There's some good TED Talks on gamification and things like that. And if I can take like just a couple of minutes, I do have a little game that I made. So there's this little bunny, and it collects carrots. And you see I hit the poison, so it decreased my points, and there's that. So if I collect the carrots, I should be able to collect. It's supposed to display a badge. It was working 2 minutes ago, of course. So badge was supposed to appear, and I was going to tell you like the reasons why this game is terrible, because it's pretty easy, so that's a good part about it. From the beginning, there's a little bit of an easy onboarding, but there's no levels, so there's no progression in this game, but there is a badge that appears, so there's that. Anyway, I guess that's where I'll end this, so thank you.